We are.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hmm. So we have our first question on how psychotropic medications affect or enhance our sense of self. I'm
Mhm.
curious if y'all have any opening thoughts on that.
I actually thought it was really interesting. And this kind of gets to the second prompt, the Savineus article. This idea, just the acknowledgement of sometimes I'm just going to stumble through because I have not thought ahead of how to say this, but this concept of sometimes when people are on psychotropics, especially if it's for something like a depression or an anxiety, this phrase of, oh, I feel like myself again, or I just want to feel like myself again. I thought that the second article or the article in the second prompt acknowledged that. And I just started to contemplate this idea of, what is self? Is it all the things that you experience, or is there an inner knowing and there feels like an invader of some sort when we have these negative experiences? So I don't think that answered the question at all, but it's a little bit of ramblings of what's going on in my mind. But I'll pause because I know we don't have much time.
Yeah, for me, it's really that question of I feel, that like how does someone feel like themselves again? It's like what does that harken back to? Like when do they feel like themselves before? And
Mm.
um, and I wonder like how much does our system, like how much does capitalism play a part in not feeling like yourself? And I think it's like, like there are just so many social factors that play a part in not feeling like oneself. And I would imagine like the feeling of not feeling like yourself are these kind of negative feelings, these negative emotions of like, depression or anxiety. And the psychotropic medications that are treating these, I think, are kind of anesthetizing those symptoms and getting you back to feeling like, okay, I can function again. I don't know if that's a fully formed thought, but that's kind of, those are my 2 cents on that.
I feel like both of you just like shared these like really like beautiful and powerful things, and then at the end we're like, I don't know, that's just what I'm thinking. Yes, so both of those.
Well, because it's interesting. It's a really squishy topic. It's like a hard topic. And forgive me, I know, Espen, I know you haven't chimed in. Can I respond to something you just said, Aaron?
Sure. Yeah.
Um, I think it's such a smart point, this idea of feel like myself again. Like, when are we going back? And is it a going back in time? Like when I was younger, I felt that way. Or is it a going back in sensation of like, oh no, what if human beings are all just pure goodness and our suffering is like it's a our suffering is a result of an interaction with the environment, to your point. And if we can understand and interpret the environment in a way that allows us to go back to that feeling of inner peacefulness, that it maybe is our true nature. This idea of like Buddha nature is coming to mind, or like what is one's true nature? And is it, if Buddhism says we're meant to suffer or that suffering is inevitable, is that as a function of kind of the human experience or a function of the human experience interacting with the environment? And therefore we can come back to kind of that sense of wholeness within ourselves.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
That's no, it does, and it's really
Yeah.
juicy. And I want to respond, but I want to hear Aspen as well.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't have like a ton to add. Like this is all landing. I'm just yeah, it's so interesting how it's like we may be like depressed for like a really long time, and yet we can disidentify with that depression and think like that's not our sense of self. That's just like a very strange thing to me. And I guess like as somebody who sometimes is in those waters, it's like there are ways that I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely like a core part of myself. But then there's also like ways that like when I'm not in it and I just like feel more alive and vibrant and like engaged in the world, like that gives me a stronger like sense of myself and like more spiritual and like whole and like just like bigger way. So to me, I guess it's like, yeah, it's interesting because it's like my mental illness is a part of me, but yeah, there are also these other parts that make me feel. I'm thinking about like in IFS, there's like the idea of like the capital S self. And yeah, just like what are these, which is like a kind of the like compassionate, curious part of us that can like see all of the parts of us and like use the word wholeness, whole being. Yeah, so those are some of my musings.
All right, Aaron, you first, and then I want to respond because I just prompted a thought.
Well, yeah, I think it's also a question of sense of self in relation to society and in relation to others. And so, Aspen, when you were talking about, when I am feeling like I think it was like you were interacting. Sorry if I'm like misparaphrasing, but it's like, when you're interacting with others or society, or you're able to have those more positive emotions, you feel more like yourself. And I was wondering if it's like in relation to others, if that sense of being able to um, perform the roles that are dictated by society easier, is maybe a greater sense of self. Yeah.
Did you want Aspen to respond to that? Yeah.
I wanted to jump in and just say we have like 6 minutes until the 13-minute mark, so we might want to start to transition. If you have any final thoughts you want to share, Golby.
Yeah, can I? It's not quite starting the transition. But there are two thoughts and they're vying for attention in my brain. Hold on, or in my mind. I think the point around interacting with society is a really interesting one. I see that in the sense of clients in a different coaching clients now who are trying to adapt to toxic environments, and they have anxiety or shame or all these negative feelings because they're in an environment that isn't healthy. And so this interaction and this interplay and like who we are, sometimes it differs based on culture. I've moved to so many different places and I can feel like myself on some level based on where I am, but I think society's norms reflected back to you tell you yes you're right, or yes or no you're wrong. And I think we internalize that. It's kind of a liberation psychology lens of like, how much are we internalizing external systems of oppression and then making ourselves bad or wrong or incomplete, and then calling that very healthy reaction to a fucked up situation mental illness, and then medicating ourselves. So I think you're spot on, Aaron. There is some interaction. There's a lot of it. When Aspen, you were talking, there was something that I thought was fascinating, and maybe this isn't the right time to explore it, but this idea of, when some of those negative feelings arise, they are part of yourself. And I have those too. Though I think I'm still in the like, not quite owning them. I'm still letting them, not be part of myself. But it just made me think of like, what about physiological illnesses, like the flu or like chickenpox, or like what extent do people identify with their physiological illnesses versus just think of it as a passing phenomenon? And like, is it different with physiological versus mental? Why does a mental illness become part of ourselves if the flu is not who we are? I don't know, just a thought. Does that make sense?
I love that thought, and it like feels very resonant with like a lot of just like indigenous psychologies that I've come across of just like having, yeah, or like even like I'm thinking about like a speaker that we had come to our clinic and talk about spirit possession and stuff like that, where it's like there's a visitor and and relating to it in that way instead of as a static thing. Also, yeah, we should move on to the other question. So I might just start to make that transition here. The second question is, if psychopharm treatment is not only about curing physiological defects, but also about adapting to a cultural pattern, the choice to take the drug or not should be made in clear view of what norms you adapt to, which speaks to some of what you were just saying, Gilby. And as a clinician, do you agree or disagree, and why? I've definitely been like had a pretty just like critical view of psychiatry for a while based around like what this question is getting at, and specifically like having ADHD and really seeing the ways that like ADHD makes people like not function as well in capitalism. And I mean, the Take Your Pills documentary definitely got into this, and just like, yeah, it's like, do we want to be medicating ourselves to fit better into the system, or like find another route? But it's this tricky thing where it's like, if you like need to like have a job to survive, I'm not going to be mad at you for like taking Adderall and being being medicated for your ADHD. So I'm always just like holding the critical lens, but then also like in terms of like the individual, it's always going to be like a different question. Like, what does this person holistically need?
Would you as a clinician bring to the awareness of your client that they may, like, you're not going to hold it, we're going to support them, but there are also other potential paths that they might not need to take, where they might not need to take this to adapt?
Potentially. I'm still trying to figure out how to bring that kind of thing in, while supporting like the client where they're at. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and also just on this question more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as ever, it would be just as a clinician, it would be just following the best interest of the client and really assessing for harm, I guess. Yeah, there was not the Svennius paper, but the other one that we read, the other article, is talking about like the really subjective experiences of people who were taking Prozac. And one of them was like, oh, I'm able to fully realize and understand the whole spectrum of my emotions, and I'm able to like interact with people, and it's a really positive thing. But then other case studies were like, oh, like someone acted really out of character, and they were like kind of in a manic state and did something that was really harmful to their work environment. And so I think it would be like, oh, are we at time?
We're at 13 minutes.
15? Yeah, so I think yeah, just being client-centered.
It starts to raise this idea of how fluid versus static is self. And that's the idea that's coming to mind. Like, if self was an all-inclusive experience, which is like whatever is happening in this moment is self, whether it's artificially induced or naturally occurring, it just raises the question of what is authenticity then, and what is self for me. Sorry, I think I'm back on the first question. My bad. For the second question, the choice to take the drug or not should be made in clear view of the norms you adapt to. I think if I were a clinician, and it's tricky in a therapeutic context, I like what you said, Aaron, around, being client-centered and assessing for harm. I think if the person had like a certain amount of ego strength, or it didn't feel like it would be really damaging, I might try and articulate that, how much of what they might be experiencing is contextually influenced versus like originating in them. Like, if anything, because I think it could be therapeutic for them to know that, sometimes our social environments are just oppressive in some way, and it's actually a really
Sorry, we gotta cut it. Sorry, Colby.